Welcome back, bones and ghouls, to Halloween in July. I've got a bunch of spooky videos for you this month and a special on my Patreon that's so good it's positively bone-rattling. Right now, the yearly pledge discount is set as low as the site will allow me to discount it, so you can get a whole year of early videos, cooking recipes, Discord access, and more. And to sweeten the deal, any yearly pledge gets their own iron-on patch made by yours truly as a free thank you gift, and anyone who pledges at that $5 recipe tier or higher gets their own patron apron, just like the ones I use in my cooking segments, so you can be snazzy when you try your hand at cooking, painting your minis for all the grimdark stuff, or all the other cool things that you can do in an apron. To get you up to speed, we're doing a little experiment this July. I've decided that I'm going to delve into the depths of mascot horror to see all that this budding niche of horror has to offer. And to make sure this experiment is as accurate and honest as it can be, we've adopted what's called the beginner's mindset. That means that we're going to check all of our preconceptions at the door when we're playing these games and experience them as if this is the first contact we've ever made with them. That means no outside lore, no fan theories or other works, and no acknowledgement of anything outside of the games, good or bad. We're giving these games as fair a shot as possible. This week, we're doing the in-progress episodic game Poppy Playtime. Before we check our preconceptions at the door, I'll give you a primer on the game series. I'm not quite sure because while these are supposed to be chapters, there is a launcher that each one has its own standalone thing through. Poppy Playtime first came out in late 2021, hot on the heels of another game I am fated to cover in this experiment, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. It's no stranger to controversies, at least early on, but I'm not that kind of channel, so we'll just acknowledge the stuff happened and moved on. This game self-describes as a quote-unquote horror/puzzle adventure and presently has 3 chapters with more to come. You play a presently unnamed former employee of Playtime Co., a toy factory ran by an eccentric industrialist who insisted that they build a massive orphanage/child utopia thing underground connected to the big toy factory where all the toys come from. And with that, it's time to enter the toy factory and leave all our expectations at the door. Let's start with the first chapter. Chapter 1 is, well, Chapter 1. But in the grand scale of things, it's more like a prologue or a demo and has been made free to reflect this. We don't learn too much about the world here, except for that this big factory, which was the nexus of the Playtime Company, looks pretty defunct, or at the very least has been closed for a good while. We'll probably learn more later though. Before entering, we see a commercial for Poppy, which is advertised to be some kind of wonder doll that can legitimately communicate with the children that play with it, which is all done in a very nicely made sort of like pseudo commercial. I'm gonna be 100% honest with you all right now. Before seeing this cool intro, my decrepit old ass thought that this guy was Poppy. Turns out he's actually called Huggy Wuggy. The unnamed player character apparently used to work for Playtime Co. and has unfinished business in the factory, so we gotta get in there. In order to gain access to the factory, you get the grab pack. The grab pack is kind of like Poppy's own portal gun, which is a very unfair comparison to make for a relatively small independent team, but it gets the idea across and you know what to expect from it now. The grab pack isn't good for just grabbing things, but also its hands and long cables are conductive, meaning you can use them to reroute power. These are actually pretty fun to use. They're intuitive and hit that sweet spot where you can't immediately figure out all the puzzles as soon as you look at them, but I never had to go find a walkthrough. And they're even better forward into later chapters. Admittedly though, chapter 1 gives you just a taste as it can be easily done inside of an hour. Yeah, this should definitely be considered more of a prologue than the first chapter. The act ends with what is easily the biggest challenge for me, the chase. Right as you're about to go deeper into the factory your own way, the big Huggy Wuggy that was in the lobby, which mysteriously disappeared, shows up again, and he's not one for talking. The chase was pretty good the first couple times I had to do it, but suffers from being very much a trial and error affair, meaning that the scare factor is seriously diminished in subsequent runs. You just keep going at it until you figure out which combination of side paths you need to take, which while not impossible to figure out the first time around, is fairly challenging and you're probably gonna whiff it a couple times. Also, you can do this whole chase and whiff right at the end, which on one hand is pretty annoying, but on the other I can respect that the chase isn't just a big set piece. Huggy actually seems to be chasing you, and you can and will die if you just sit around. You do need to deal with him at the end. Now that I think about it, the chase is both the high and low point of this chapter. Let's move on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 feels like the first proper act of Poppy, who we met in earnest at the end of Chapter 1. Turns out she's very much alive in some sort of way we don't understand yet. Let's not think about that right now though, because we've got some puzzles to do and more mechanics to puzzle with. While there was some grabbing and reaching with the grab pack in Chapter 1, you can now use it to swing across gaps, which is a whole lot of fun, and I wish they let me do it more. The grabber is also now strong enough to pull you when it attaches to something sturdy enough to support your weight. You also get a new green hand for your grabber, which lets you store and expend a charge of electricity to wherever you need to put it, and that means a whole new style of puzzles to do. So now, between the power line, swinging, and stored power puzzles, that's 3 different ways we're using the grabber outside of, grabbing things. That isn't half bad for an indie game. Also, we have a new antagonist. Mommy Longlegs. We get a little promo for her toy counterpart at the beginning of this act, which I'll say that the intro videos at the beginning of each episode are just really well done. They're well produced and looked like something that actually could be a late 80s to early 90s toy commercial. Mommy Longlegs swipes Poppy, and if we don't have Poppy, we don't have access to the train network to get deeper into the factory, so we're just gonna have to play her games. Literally. Turns out it's been such a long time since any actual children came down to the play area that she's been getting antsy. You're going to complete the trials and she's going to watch you do them. The trials aren't too bad. They're very much tests of your new abilities, and these aren't exactly the toughest challenges. You'll be able to squeak by even if you're having a hard time getting familiar with the grabber's new mechanics. But at the same time, you can have a lot of fun with them if you're getting real comfortable with the grabber. The obstacle course is especially fun once you know how to yank yourself around with it. My only gripe is that the Whack-A-Wuggy game is pretty similar to the challenge right before it, and while I did have a harder time with it at first, turning the brightness up utterly trivializes the challenge since the main issue seems to be I just can't see where anyone's coming from. I guess this is as good as a place as any to bring up that you do have a flashlight in Poppy Playtime, you just don't get to control it. The flashlight just kind of turns on by itself when the game would otherwise be too dark to see, and turns off when they decide it needs to be dark. And while it's not as interesting to me as the puzzle design, since personally I think Poppy is at its strongest when it's getting crazy with the puzzles, Chapter 2 expands on the collectibles and world building in the game so far. There's the color-coded VHS tapes, which while we're in the first game, they're much more present here, and unfortunately I'm not the best at finding ones that are off the critical path. But I did find enough to give me an idea of what's going on. Also, oh hey, cameo. Like an actual cameo and not that Zombie Simpsons styled, I am a famous person and I am in this crap. Man's playing a proper role here that fits in the story. Good on him. There are also trophies, which I'll admit I'm just bad at collecting things, but it gives you a reason to explore and do subsequent runs. As for the world building, we get more of an idea of what exactly they were doing down in the toy factory and how the player character might fit into it. We won't get anything concrete until the next chapter though. Also, while listening to some of these tapes and cinematics, the whole time I was thinking, oh yeah, this is around the time when analog horror started getting really popular. And I do mean getting popular, because stuff like Local 58 and Gemini Home Entertainment date to the previous decade, and depending on where you draw the line between an ARG and analog horror, there's a lot of it going on well before 2020, or even before 2010 if you're willing to accept stuff that predates the term. This kind of gets away with being a course correction explained by going deeper into the factory to parts that outsiders were never supposed to see, but the tonal shift from the CEO being reminiscent of a Cave Johnson type, being all snarky over a pre-recorded message, to more of an analog horror antagonist type is noticeable enough to where you might find yourself going, huh. Hey, editing Charl here, just a quick correction / disambiguation. I briefly mistakenly combined the characters Elliot Ludwig and Leif Pierre into the same person. Elliot Ludwig is the founder and assumed CEO, and Leif Pierre is the guy you hear being all snarky at the beginning of Chapter 1. I still hold to the idea, though, that the tonal shifts between Chapters 1 and 2 is a bit noticeable to the point where you're going to be scratching your head. Also, I get them mixed up a bit when we're talking about Chapter 3, but we'll correct that again too. It doesn't help that his whole head is like redacted as a black box, which is just the most analog horror thing you can do. We can think about this more later though, because it's time for a cooking segment. We're gonna do some breakfast burritos today because I'm just feeling breakfast burritos. Like, when are you not feeling breakfast burritos? Excuse the mess, by the way. As you can see, the big move is pretty soon as I'm filming this. Before we do anything, we're gonna prep the filling so that everything is ready to go by the time we're ready to assemble. Nothing too crazy now. We're just gonna grate our cheese, which, yes, it is almost always better to grate it yourself instead of buying pre-shredded, since ounce for ounce this stuff is cheaper, tastier, and melts better. Plus, this takes hardly a literal minute to do, and then you're good for the whole block. Set the cheese in a bowl or something for easy access later, and now we do the potato. Again, this isn't exactly beef Wellington here. Peel the potato, give it a little rinsey rinse, and then shred it like you did the cheese, putting that into a separate bowl. Finally, slice up an avocado and set those on a plate so we aren't scrambling to do that later. We've got a couple more things we're gonna do here before we're cooking proper. Firstly, light that burner under the pan and get it warm. And that would be a good time to beat and salt your eggs. Set the soon-to-be scrambled eggs away from the heat and let the salt do its thing while we take our tortillas, put them into the pan, with no oil by the way, and then cover them with cheese. You can put a lid over the pan if you wanted to speed things along, but we're not trying to cook or even fully melt the cheese on top. We just want to get the cheese to where it's just barely starting to melt and adhere to the tortilla, and then pull that out of the pan. Set those aside, and now we're ready to cook. And hey, look at that, I remembered to put on my apron. Now we're really cooking. Yeah, it's early as I'm doing this. First order of business is the bacon. Cook it however crispy or soft as you like, and then set it aside for a minute before chopping it into little bits, which you can go ahead and spread over your cheese-covered tortillas now or reserve to a bowl. Don't drain any of that bacon fat, but instead carefully put your shredded potatoes into the pan and spread them real thin with a spatula. Partially cover the pan and cook for a couple minutes or until you start to see the edges of your hash brown. Maybe divide the hash brown in half here, as we're going to be splitting this anyway, give it a flip, and then cover again and let the other side get browned up as well. Once it's done, just go ahead and place the potatoes right on top of your tortillas. We're almost done here. Go ahead and put a little bit of sour cream on top of the potatoes on top of that tortilla, and anything else you haven't added yet outside of the eggs. This should be just enough time passed and just enough bacon fat to where the eggs are ready to cook and there's just enough grease left for the eggs to cook in. Cooking the eggs is likely going to be the easiest part of this. Just dump them in, move them around with a spatula a bit to get everything cooked, and then split the portion of scrambled eggs in half so that one half goes to each burrito we've got here. This should all take less than a minute to do since the pan's already hot and well greased. Time for the hard part. We gotta roll this up. Now don't worry if you can't quite get it right, because for one, we're putting a lot of stuff in here, and for another, it doesn't need to be perfectly sealed because we're not done yet. Once the burrito vaguely resembles a burrito, it's gonna go back onto the heat like crease side down for just a sec to get the cheese to fully seal everything in. It's no accident that we partially melted the cheese over the whole tortilla. Grill it just for a bit now, hardly even 30 seconds. Once it's off, we're gonna get some parchment paper and wrap it up just like this so that the paper helps keep everything together as the cheese remelts and resolidifies, making a seal for your burrito. Now we're finally gonna cut this sucker down the middle and get a little side thing of salsa for dipping. Why salsa on the side? Because the best way to avoid burrito leakage is to keep all the wet things as a side item. Seriously, that's gonna save a lot of your clothes from the dreaded burrito drippage. And there we have it. One breakfast burrito, which while I wasn't intending this, took less than half an hour to make according to my footage, and I only used one pan. Now, as always, if you like what I'm doing here and want the full recipe with a standalone cooking video, it's available on patreon.com/charlatanwonder, where we're running that Halloween in July special, so all yearly pledges get a free iron-on patch as a thank you, and anyone who pledges yearly at the $5 recipe tier or higher gets their own patron apron, just like mine, as a free gift. And that's on top of all the great benefits you get from being a member over at the Patreon. Now let's get into the final act of Poppy Playtime. Welcome to the third and most recent chapter of Poppy Playtime. This came out back in February, so it's pretty fresh. You might notice that the graphics are noticeably different from the last two games. Things look a lot more worn down and defined, with things like the VCR being entirely replaced, and the whole color palette seems to have shifted. This might be in part because Chapter 3 is an entirely different executable from Chapters 1 and 2. In fact, like I alluded to at the beginning of this video, each chapter has been its own game with a launcher selecting which executable you run. I'm not sure if Chapters 1 and 2 are their own EXEs, but in each game you've got to configure your initial settings like resolution and what have you, like it's the first time you booted up the game, and each game noticeably has its own version of not just a UI, but what options you have access to as well. Chapter 1 is fairly Spartan, whereas Chapter 2 goes as far as to let you select what runtime you want to play the game on. My Chapter 2 was running on Vulkan, by the way, but I did not do any comparisons between that, DirectX 11, and 12. And while Chapter 3 doesn't let you choose your runtime anymore, the individual options are much more varied now with more precise FOV settings, which also seems to let you take it wider than any of the other chapters. There's also this odd rubber banding or whatever's going on with the grab pack when you turn, which I couldn't figure out what settings I needed to do to mitigate that, but I did try. Now that we've picked that oddity over, welcome to Rapture, I mean Playcare. While the analog horror motif is still present, this whole intro segment into the Playcare region is very much an homage to the intro to BioShock, which if I had a nickel for every mascot horror series that made BioShock references, I'd make a reference to a cartoon I never actually watched since I was a little too old for it when it was out. It's a little jarring since back in chapter 1, the CEO was again very much more reminiscent of Cave Johnson. Again, just like earlier, that was Leaf Pierre that was being all snarky over the intercom in chapter 1, and the CEO, Elliot Ludwig, is a different person, but I still hold to the idea that the tonal shifts sometimes are a little odd. Then it was more analog horror in chapter 2, and here he is in chapter 3 doing his best Andrew Ryan impersonation, which I know this is an outward thing, how he's trying to address parents and children coming to his giant child bunker, but it's a little all over the place sometimes. Like, I know it's like how he is privately versus how he is publicly, but it's enough to where you go, huh. The intro segment with all this Bioshock stuff ends, as far as I can tell, as soon as you get off the little trolley thing. The grab pack is expanded on even more here with not one, but 2 whole new hand attachments on top of the conductive one that you had in the last chapter. On top of the conductive one, you now have one that lets you use boost pads scattered around play care, and later on in the chapter, you acquire the fabled gun. It only shoots flares, but that's all you're gonna need. Also, it completely negates fall damage as long as you're not falling onto something that's gonna, like, really hurt if you land on it. However, unfortunately, it seems there is no more swinging, at least for now, which is a bummer because I had a lot of fun doing that. If I had to guess, this might be to do with how now you're going to be using the grab pack as a winch to pull yourself up, and maybe the swinging mechanics mess with that in some places, or at least made things very complicated. I hope they find a way to make it work in the future, though. Things are much more visually intense now. Sure, the factory wasn't exactly Katamari Damacy, but Playcare kicks it up a notch and feels closer to a horror puzzler than a puzzle game with horror elements. You see this a lot in the boarding house section where you get some good old-fashioned visual halloo by our new antagonist, Catnap. Let's talk about Catnap in Chapter 3's intro theming for a bit. While I can really appreciate the whole authentically styled animation, I feel like this chapter's intro strays a little too far into the analog horror stuff and accidentally wanders into a bit of bad creepypasta territory. Like, it's a little on the nose with the whole angle of a weirdly spooky character in a children's cartoon that, like, people swear they remember, but as you see here, it's getting erased from all the episodes and branding after controversy, and especially with how uncanny all the other characters act when Catnap shows up. But this is less of a deal breaker for me and more just being a bit disappointed that they maybe took a step in the wrong direction with this one. Outside of this one thing, Poppy did a pretty good job pivoting into a more traditional horror styling of a game while still keeping the puzzles that make it noteworthy. In fact, I really like some of the jump puzzles here. Now, the first and second act both end in a big chase. Poppy Playtime likes its big chases. They like chase sequences so much that there are 3 in this chapter. On that note, out of all the chases I've experienced so far in this game, I think the one I like the most is here in Chapter 3 when you're in the school. During the school chase, there's less trial and error than the first few and more puzzling as you run. Also, while I found this out the hard way that you cannot juke this lady, there are enough alternate pathways that if you need to, you can run away from her and loop around to avoid her long enough to solve a puzzle along this chase. And finally, while we're on the subject of chases, this chapter decides to do something different and doesn't end on a chase, but instead gives you a proper boss encounter with Catnap. Now, don't expect a Dark Souls-like dodge and bonk pattern here, or a shoot it until it's dead type deal. You're still a mostly defenseless regular guy as far as we know, pitted against horrors that you are very clearly outmatched against, but there's still a decent challenge factor to it, and I also found out the hard way, which feels like a theme for me sometimes, that you can indeed whiff it at the very end if you aren't paying attention or not being careful. If anything, the way they do resource management and watching all your corners in this fight is really cool, and I'm glad it wasn't just taking pot shots at Catnap with the gun. Now that I've given Poppy Playtime an honest-to-goodness chance without any preconceptions, I actually like the game so far. Maybe not nearly as much as I like Bendy, and I have to admit the first antagonist being called Huggy Wuggy was a big hurdle to get over, but the game itself is a fun mix between puzzles and the occasional spooky moment if you're willing to just kind of look over how sometimes overly kiddie things get. Also, as for my take on the spookies, remember that when it comes to games, I've got a pretty high tolerance thanks to years of doing this, but there was a moment that got me in the third chapter. Also, on top of being a solid puzzle, puzzler, Poppy Playtime has great potential to also throw in some really cool platforming challenges in the mix if they're able to find a way to combine the swinging from the second act and the boost pads from the third, and also whatever else they're thinking of for the fourth act. I really hope they do that though, because honestly, that'd be really cool. I'd love to have like some fun platforming puzzle challenges or even some swinging challenges. Given all the games we've covered so far, I'd say that all the Poppy chapters so far they have for sale are a much better value for your money than either of the Hello Neighbor titles, and when it comes down to this versus Bendy, I think that's a close race. Bendy and the Ink Machine is $5 cheaper, but doesn't quite have the level of gameplay that Poppy has. However, Bendy has better theming and in my opinion better writing than Poppy because while the storytelling Mob Entertainment has put into the chapters so far has very high production value, Bendy's got that better theming and a more cohesive world building which lends itself to a better story. Poppy's first chapter is free now too if you just want to give it a try and make your own decisions. Poppy's also unfinished at the moment, but not in a bad, janky way, but as in we only have the first 3 of we don't know how many chapters to come. If I had to guess, based on the pacing of the story, I think there's only going to be 1 or maybe 2 more chapters now that we've gotten to know the big bad and the other reasons for the player character being there. I've got other predictions and ideas too, but the story isn't finished yet, so I'll leave the theory crafting to the professionals. And that's another one for Halloween in July 2024. Thank you all so much for watching, and don't forget about that massive special I'm having right now on patreon.com/charlatanwonder, where all the yearly rates are discounted as low as they'll go, and anyone who takes advantage of that yearly discount gets their own iron-on patch, and anyone pledging at the $5 recipe tier or higher at that yearly discounted rate gets their own patron apron, just like mine, for free, which I do make myself because I'm just that hardcore. Head on over through the link in the description to check it out and help me keep this channel going, and if you can't or just aren't able to, that's cool. Being here is more than enough, and I appreciate you. Now let's sign off. Remember that no matter what you do, be it pencil sketches, making fishing lures, or anything creative, that what you do should never be called content. It is art. Content is a word that's been twisted into meaning a means to grind up all your skills, aspiration, and hopes into a gray sludge that is mindlessly consumed to make a line go up for someone else's benefit. Your art in no way deserves that. Your art is a reflection of you by the very nature of its creation, and in no way do you deserve that. Fight against the contentification of everything by fighting for your art. You're worth it. Stay saucy, everyone.
So, I'm just trying to steam my head here. You know, just make sure my sinuses are nice and clear for recording. But this has become somebody's napping spot. Yeah, it's, sir, I need to put this where you are because I don't want, like, a pot full of, like, hot boiling water directly against, like, the wood finish of this table. And, yes, I need to blast my sinuses with steam to loosen up any mucus. That's what you do for steaming your head. Could you please... Of course you're not having this. Sir, your bed is right there. It's got a nice blankie, too. Why you gotta sit where I need to put things? Come on, I don't want to force you off. That's mean. Oh, but it worked. Cool. You know what? I know what I can do for you. There you are, little guy. Now you can sit on the towel just like you like, and I can steam my head. Everyone wins. What?